so Chris.
Okay, good, thanks. Before I start, I'm just curious, how many people here wrote ODNB entries? Is there, I know at least one.
259.
Yes, 259. Okay, so always curious people's involvement with the ODNB. I think everyone here will know of the ODNB, which was called on its release in 2004 the greatest book ever, a more enthralling read than all the novels ever entered for the Booker Prize put together. The Daily Mail, where these giddy pronouncements appeared, is not known for understatement, but more cautious academic researchers have long held the ODNB in similarly high esteem. Stephen Collini, writing in the London Review of Books, found himself experiencing a rare and wholly unironic feeling that mixes pride and humility with a dash of wonder, when he considered generations to come making use of this vast consolidation of scholarly accuracy for the purposes of their own, which may barely be imaginable to us now. Collini's response, awe, has until recently arguably been the most appropriately scholarly response to the ODNB considered in its entirety. The enormous scope of the ODNB, which is the work of roughly 10,000 scholars, runs to 60 volumes in print and is made up of more than 62 million words, quickly defeats the capacities of even those most eager to praise it. Awe has been the most reasonable scholarly response, that is, until the recent emergence of so-called distant reading. Distant reading is the term first coined by Stanford literary historian Franco Moretti that has now become shorthand for computer-assisted study of corpora whose scale exceeds human capacities. In this paper, I want to argue first that the ODNB offers unparalleled perspective on the broadest changes in elite British culture, and second, that such perspective is uniquely and perhaps even exclusively available by way of computational methods. At the heart of this paper is the question, what can 62 millions of historical writing tell us about elite lives over time? Distant reading the ODNB, I contend, not only gives us a powerful new way to study British history, culture, and historiography, but also indicates new scholarly payoffs at the intersection of digital publishing, programming know-how, and historical research. So this is a brief overview of what I'm going to talk about today. The ODNB is now an indispensable scholarly resource for just about every field touching on British history and culture. Yet apart from a brief flurry of scholarship surrounding its 2004 publication, it has rarely itself been the object of scholarly investigation. What then do we know about the ODNB? Even its contributing authors and researchers who use the ODNB daily can sometimes feel like the fabled blind men gathered around an elephant, who, each feeling a different part, likened it variously to a wall, a spear, a stick, and a tree. When it comes to the ODNB, understanding of local texture far surpasses comprehension of the whole beast. But asking what we know about the ODNB in aggregate isn't merely a rhetorical question either. Andrew Piper has identified a typical response to digital scholarship that he calls the "we already knew that" impulse. My colleague Scott Weingart has written, any historical claim to an acceptable question within the historical paradigm can easily be countered with, but we already knew that. Either the question's been around long enough that every plausible claim has been covered, or the new evidence or theory is similar enough to something pre-existing that it can be taken as precedent. Scholarship based on quantitative digital methods, the argument goes, does not contribute new knowledge, but rather gives us the same knowledge via slightly different and perhaps ideologically suspect means. One critic writes of the quantitatively derived illustrations in a recent book, for instance, as striking as these infographics are in their encapsulations of historical truth, they don't typically tell us anything that we didn't already know. In making such arguments, however, critics of digital history inadvertently create for themselves a new burden. What exactly do these wizened savants always already know? There's a slight hint of a shell game, or thimblewry, when it always turns out that we knew that already. Doesn't it seem as though the critics could simply be moving the shell with historical knowledge underneath around just fast enough that we lose track of where it started? More charitably, Matthew Lincoln has suggested that the "we already knew that" impulse isn't a willful deception, but more of an unavoidable after effect of human cognition. For Lincoln, scholars encountering digital scholarship fall prey to their own, otherwise useful skills in matching particular cases to broader concepts and generalities. We're so damn good at coming up with post facto historical explanations to contextualize any given observation, he writes, that we're particularly susceptible to confabulating these post facto rationalizations with the idea that we somehow knew the results of this quantitative work already. Lincoln illustrates the point with a thought experiment in which he makes two mutually exclusive historical arguments using a single data set and its inverse. He doesn't tell us which is the true data set and which is its inverse, but insofar as each argument seems to make sense according to some pre-existing art historical narrative, Lincoln leaves readers to realize that, in at least one of his examples, what they already knew was in fact the very opposite of the true data. Lincoln may indeed be right that post-factualism is more a matter of scholarly pattern matching gone awry than sleight of hand. But in any event, it seems salutary, epistemologically speaking, to try to say in advance what we already know. Piper has even cheekily proposed what he calls a cultural analytics betting pool, to put the rest that we already knew that impulse, where people are 100% right after the fact. Now, I won't go as far as to suggest turning this august seminar into a Ladbrokes, but I do want to pose some questions about the ODNB at the outset, and invite folks both here and watching online to make some initial guesses before I show the answers. This would be brave, of course, because the guessers risk exposing, either to themselves or to others, that what they thought they knew about the ODNB might not be the case. On the flip side, there's the inevitable glory if it turns out you're right. The point in any case is to try to erect some kind of barrier in front of the we already knew that impulse, to postpone self-congratulation on what it is we already know, at least until the plaudits are demonstrably earned. So then, some questions, which my presentation will endeavor to answer in what follows, but this is a chance to sort of think about what it is we already know. What's the chronological distribution of ODNB entries? That is, how many entries per century? Are there, say, more 17th century biographies or 19th century biographies? Do patterns match demographic trends? What year is the ODNB's high watermark when most of its biographical subjects were alive? What's the ODNB's chronological midpoint, which I'm defining as the year when we find exactly half of the words dedicated to subjects born before this date and half dedicated to subjects born afterwards? Does the ratio of married subjects rise or fall over time? What single year in the 16th century saw the most deaths of ODNB subjects? What single year saw the most deaths of ODNB subjects overall? What single scholarly article is cited twice as much as any other scholarly article cited in the ODNB? What's the most cited monograph? What are ODNB subjects' parents' most common occupations? What are the most typical areas of renown for ODNB subjects? When was the last abbess to merit an ODNB bio? What century gives us the ODNB's first political wife? Is a monarch's biography more likely to mention places outside the British Isles or a scientist's? When scholars write about theater history, do they write more about people or about places? What single sentence appears most often in women's biographies? And which single year is mentioned most frequently in the entirety of the ODNB? Before I turn to the answers to these questions, I want to say a word about what makes the answers possible in the first place. In his Leslie Stephen special lecture of 2004, Sir Keith Thomas observed, "It's hard to think of any aspect of the British past which will not be illuminated by running a word search of this colossal database." Thanks to Joe Payne, Philip Carter, and a research bursary from the ODNB, the version that I'm using in richly marked up digital format allows for far more than word searches. Meticulously encoded in the markup language known as SGML, the text of the ODNB is easily sortable and queryable according to its highly detailed scheme. In this format, the ODNB is a goldmine for computational methods. A couple examples may suffice to suggest the exciting range of questions this corpus will support, in addition to the questions that I've already posed. Consider the tag wealth. Famously, ODNB editors ask each of their contributors to include for their subjects individuals' wealth at death, defined either as an official record or other valuation. The existence of wealth tags means that an enterprising economic historian could scoop up thousands of data points almost instantaneously and calculate, albeit cautiously, the total wealth of individuals with ODNB entries. In a very different register, we might consider the BAP tag, referring to a date of baptism. What can we learn about long-term patterns concerning community, multiculturalism, and secularization simply by attending to rates of baptism in prominent lives across time? It's important to honor and emphasize the enormous manual labor that went into tagging the ODNB. I have to say this is quite simply the most useful markup I've encountered as a scholar. For the 2004 release, OUP supplied external contractors with a 285 document of markup instructions, 285-page document of markup instructions with detailed plans for marking dates, places, variant names, legal cases, religious dominations, and much else. The results exhibit the inevitable human errors, but miraculously few. As if to confirm Joe Gouldy and David Armitage's remark in the Historian's Manifesto, that historians turning their attention to big data can simultaneously pioneer new frontiers of data manipulation and make historical questions relevant to modern concerns. It's possible to create valuable structured data sets using little more than a Python library, the Python library Beautiful Soup to parse the markup. The ODNB markup is most certainly not the work of disembodied algorithms, but of meticulous, judicious, flesh and blood humans whose unglamorous but absolutely central prior work in tagging and editing fundamentally underpins the research that I present here. As Shoemaker and Hitchcock have noted, no doubt alluding to excessively quantitative histories of the 1970s, the analysis of big data risks making digital history inaccessible, technocratic, and in some ways irrelevant for a wider audience. So at the risk of stating the obvious, I am not an algorithm either. The questions that I ask and the methods for answering them follow from my peculiar mix of historical interests, cultural biases, and technical skills. In my case, the distance of distant reading is more than an allusion to Franco Moretti's method. As a mixed heritage American literary scholar studying British history and culture from across an ocean, I cannot help but approach the ODNB from a distance. British history and culture can look very different depending on one's proximity to Britain, and like the majority of the ODNB's global Anglophone readers, I'm ultimately an interested but implicated outsider. Some examples from my geography. I was born in Rochester, New York, raised in Maryland, and reside now in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. I've lived amidst the legacy of the ODNB's subjects long before I knew about the ODNB. Today I make my living as a professor of English at Carnegie Mellon University, named after Gilded Age industrialist Andrew Carnegie, a first-generation Scots immigrant from a radical Chartist family of weavers, and Andrew Mellon, a second-generation Scots-Irish banker with family roots in County Tyrone, Ireland, who would become U.S. ambassador to the UK. At once too far from Britain to do daily work in its physical archives, and too enmeshed in British culture to turn elsewhere, I resort to the computational prosthetic of distant reading to help make sense of the global historical force that has influenced not only my life, but the lives of so many around the world. So now I'm going to turn to a less formal version and sort of go through this Jupyter notebook and see some of the broadest outlines of elite lives at scale. So let's start with the shape of the beast. Where are ODNB subjects born? Here we see that the vast majority are born in England, with substantial chunks in Scotland, Ireland, Wales, Germany, USA, and so forth. The geography of death looks relatively similar. And here's another way of looking at it. Feel free to stop me if there's something that catches your eye here. I'm going to be presenting a lot of charts like this, or charts in general, but I'm happy to stop and answer questions. Okay, so now let's think about the lives over time. So this is the estimated UK population over time in tens of millions. We have sort of broad rise rising from about 1600. To what extent does the ODNB mirror this pattern or depart from it? This is the number of ODNB entries by approximate years of birth and death. One of the things that stands out here demographically, of course, is the 17th century, right? You have this seemingly considerable overrepresentation of 17th century figures relative to the general demographics. So what are the particular spikes for subjects alive per year? So 1642 is the 17th century high mark, then it sort of starts retreating. And then 1925 is the general high. That is to say that that represents the years when most subjects are alive. But what happens if we start to think about men's entries and women's entries? What we see here is a roughly similar pattern among men's entries, but women's entries really rise consistently towards 1922. And this might be obvious already, but the reason that there's the sharp drop-off going towards 2000 is that people aren't dead yet. That's the many of those people, as we get closer to the present, of course, will get entries because the ODNB continues to update. But I think that's remarkable. In particular, the relationship between the way that the number of women's entries sort of bump up these general numbers in the early 20th century. Okay. So let's pay attention to years of death. We have some interesting moments, particularly peaks, some of which we might expect, some which we wouldn't. So the answer to the question, which 16th century year includes the most deaths, this is 1558. This is the year that Elizabeth takes the throne from Mary. And this includes Protestant martyrs, it includes many other different kinds of deaths, but it's remarkable as a kind of inflection point. 1908 is the year that has the most deaths overall. 1649 and 1660 are relatively self-explanatory as sort of major years in the Revolution and Restoration. 1908, this, as far as I can tell, is just a question of demography. That is to say, there's a huge peak in the number of subjects that are born in sort of the 1830s, 1840s, and they sort of are dying, many of them, right about 1908. Okay, so to what extent are these years specific to ODNB subjects, and to what extent do they reflect broader patterns? These are the general mortality rates in England and Wales for that same time period. 1920 is high mortality. 1908 is not particularly high. So there's something sort of unique to the ODNB here about 1908 presenting itself. Okay, so let's think about other sort of ways that we can think about the ODNB in its entirety as a sort of object of study. We can divide up its words by when subjects are born. The midpoint here is 1785. Half the words are dedicated to people who lived beforehand, and half afterwards. And now the question of subjects married. I don't know how many people said to themselves that they thought more people were married or less people were married. Basically, since about 1800, we've got this pretty consistent, it's 800, we've got this pretty consistent rise of marriage, such that getting towards the present, nearly 100% of people in the ODNB were married. As people in this room likely know, the ODNB revised many of the entries for the 2004 publication, and this is the percentage of those biographies according to life dates. So we see sort of a good number, getting towards 40% of the 18th and 19th century biographies that are revised. Okay, I'm going to turn now to a different way of understanding this beast of the ODNB, and this is occupations, historical significance, and areas of renown. So the ODNB categorizes its biographies among 25 areas of renown. And so when you simply count how many people are in each of those areas, you get a graph that looks something like this. Politics, government, and diplomacy is the largest category, followed by literature, journalism, and publishing. Down at the end, down at the bottom, sports, games, and pastimes, technology. Those have the fewest entries. But we have over 12,000 entries that can broadly be classified as politics, government, and diplomacy. So there's more to say about these areas of renown, and in fact those are sort of helpful buckets to put in the various biographies in order to sort of understand more. So if we ask how long are the biographies, who's likely to have longer biographies? The answer, perhaps unsurprisingly, is that royalty, rulers, and aristocracy have the longest biographies. I'll show that's the number of words down there at the bottom. Business and finance have relatively long biographies in film and broadcasting. The shortest biographies belong to fields like medicine, music, agriculture and food, religion, and belief. I think we can imagine that the tropes of historiography differ depending upon the kind of life that's being narrated. So which kinds of biographies fall more to the sides of emphasizing people, and which fall more to the sides of emphasizing places? That's actually a question with an observable answer. In this case, the biographies related to music, theater and entertainment, literature, journalism, and publishing are weighted much more strongly towards people. Transport and communication, travel and exploration, these are weighted much more towards places, but we see a sort of interesting spread there of sort of modes of historiography. When we tell the lives of, for example, army officers, we don't tell the lives of their social relations. We tell the lives of the places they were stationed, the places of battle, and so forth. Beyond the areas of renown, each ODNB subject has a more granular historical significance. These descriptions can be quite precise and vary widely. There's no controlled vocabulary here, so you have to sort of do some aggregating on often used terms. But these are historical significance of 100 and more examples. So the most prominent is Army officer, politicians up there as well. Many writers. One thing to note here, the number of Church of England clergymen, which is number probably 6 or 7 in terms of ranked historical significance. We can ask similar questions, which, namely, when we write about these figures with each of these particular professions or occupations, are we likely to include a lot of names or not? It turns out when we write about magnates, we include a large average of names. Same is true of courtiers and actors and actresses. Theater history is incredibly social in its historiography. And then when we normalize for biography length, we can see just how these sort of compare with one another. Basically, above this line, we see engravers, portrait painters, translators, actresses and actors. These are the kinds of professions that when we write about them, we talk about other people. Geologists, Air Force officers, philosophers, these seem to demand fewer mentions of other people. Okay, so one of the things that we can do with this data is to ask about the rise and fall of particular professions or occupations. So what I'm doing here is asking about when a particular occupation first came on the scene. So when do we get the first author? When do we get the first aviator? In this case, I'm limiting it to women. So the question I posed earlier, when was the last abbess? The answer is that is Margaret Radcliffe, born in 1582. Who were the first political wives? 18th century figures, Catherine Pelham and Hester Pitt. But beyond that, this is a little hard to see, and I apologize. Maybe I'll make it, that doesn't help. I'll try to make it bigger. Beyond that, we can see when female occupations or historical significance sort of come into the picture. So at the top, author, abbess, princess, noblewoman, magnate, royal mistress, landowner. These are the fields with relatively early appearances and long durations. And then we can see, as we move on, sort of in the 17th century, we have the first Quaker preacher. We have daughter of Oliver Cromwell. We have the first businesswoman. And here's our political wife in the 18th century. What we can see as we sort of move closer to the present, of course, is the emergence of new fields, new categories of occupation. Tennis player, aviator. But also interesting here is the emergence of older fields that are here for the first time, merit inclusion for women. Potter. The first potter to be included in the 20th century, first female potter to be included is the 20th century potter. Okay, so moving on, what are the ODNB subjects' parents' most common occupations? In the case of women, women's mothers tend to be actresses. Noblewomen or teachers. Men's mothers tend to be gentlewomen, noblewomen, and school teachers. Men's fathers tend to be landowners, Church of England clergymen, and merchants. We can Also take the approach of asking what years and words and sentences appear frequently. So, what years are mentioned most frequently in the ODNB? The year mentioned most often is 1914. I won't ask people what they guessed at this point, but I am curious. 1919, 1939, 1945. Not terribly surprising once we see it, but it's also quite easy to create a post facto justification. 1642, 1660, 1688, big years, of course. What are the most frequently appearing words, years, and sentences in women's biographies? The most frequently appearing sentence, which appears in 51 biographies. She never married. And I should say, and I'm sure Philip could confirm that in part this is a function of the form that authors were given when they had to write the biographies. That is, one had to give an account of the marital status. But the frequent years, 1939, 1914, 1919, 1920, definitely sort of heavily weighted towards the 20th century, of course. What are the most frequently appearing words, years in men's biographies? Men's years, 1914. Most frequent sentence, they had no children, 311 biographies. He was survived by his wife in 206 biographies. He never married in 112 biographies. Okay, so now I'm going to turn to a section on historiography. What are the most frequently cited books in the ODNB? Well, here they are. Far and away, the winner is, of course, the DNB. And some other sort of standard resources that we would expect. So this is in some sense illuminating, in some senses unsurprising. It gets interesting to me, at least, when we start asking about the post-war scholarship, modern scholarship, and monographs. So, which post-war book titles influenced the ODNB most strongly? The one that wins is the London Stage, 1660 to 1800, and that's cited over 400 times. Various other important reference works.
Chris, can you read a few out? Because I can't say them back.
Sorry, what?
Can you read a few out? Because I can't
Oh, sure, yeah.
Just read a few out.
The Dictionary of Art, that's the second. The Register of Admissions to Middle Temple. A Dictionary of British and Irish Travelers in Italy, 1701 to 1800. The Seminary Priests, A New History of Ireland. The Commissioned Sea Officers of the Royal Navy. Thank you. Yeah, I'm happy to read out as needed. What are the most cited post-war monographs? Well, when we sort of look through these and figure out which ones are the monographs, Muir's Britain in the Defeat of Napoleon, 1807 to 1815, is the single most cited monograph in the ODNB, followed by Peter Collinson's The Elizabethan Puritan Movement, and then John McCulloch's Thomas Cranmer. Which book authors are most cited in the ODNB? And this is I think always fascinating to look at, because very few of these are 20th century writers, 20th, 21st century. Joseph Foster, I assume that's the I haven't actually looked, but that's the Cambridge and Oxford alumniensis. Walpole, right? I think the first, do I have this right, is the first 20th century historian Peter Collison.
Is it Andy Wood?
I think that's the 17th century.
Ah, okay, yeah.
When we look at post-1945 publication date, here we start to see some modern historians. Why are we seeing Boswell and Swift here? These are just sort of editions, post-1945 editions that are cited. So, which journal article is cited twice as many times as its next closest neighbor? The answer is Sidney Hutchinson's The Royal Academy of Schools, 1768 to 1830. Followed by these other articles. And then when we look at the most frequently cited article authors in the ODNB, there's Hutchinson, the art historian Mary Edmond, second. Many of you will know some of these names that I don't. I'm going to conclude, not because it's the last thing that one could do with this data, but it's an illuminating place to finish on the topic of religion. So let's have a look at how different denominations emerge and fall in ODNB data. So Anglican entries as a percentage of all ODNB entries over time. By this graph, it looks like the Reformation starts in the late 15th century, which is a little odd. That's because I'm going with birth dates. But I think that we can infer what's going on here. This is the Reformation. Catholic entries as a percentage of ODNB entries over time. Presbyterian. And I should say that these denomination groups are the ODNB's own denomination groups. All right, so I'm going to put them all together down here. One thing that sort of may be hard to notice here has to do with the sort of dominance, but also role of Catholicism, sort of post-Reformation. So here, what we get is sort of Christianity and sort of major faith categories over time. There are not a lot of non-Christian entries in the ODNB. But once we sort of take the Church of England out of it for the purposes of this, we can see the Church of England just sort of far and above all of the other sort of categories here. The Church of England is dominant between 1600 and 18. But let's do the same thing and leave the Church of England out of it, modifying the dates a little to see the period 1700 to 1900. Here we get sort of a more granular view, and we actually see the sort of interesting local rise of Catholicism in the 19th century, right? Anglo-Catholicism, Cardinal Newman, and so forth. Let's see. There is quite a bit more that we could say about this data, and actually, I'm happy to do some queries on the spot if there are particular questions that have arisen. I think that's I think that's where I will wrap up for now. I'm gonna end sort of with a bit of a caution, though. The first question before my caution is: did we learn anything? Did we learn anything that we didn't know before? I hope the answer is yes. I assume the answer is yes. But I nevertheless want to end on a cautionary note, and it's this. I started by arguing that the distant reading the ODNB only gives us not only gives us a powerful new way to study British history, culture, and historiography, and also indicates new scholarly payoffs at the intersection of digital publishing, programming know-how, and historical research. All of that is indeed true. Yet in order to understand what an approach like this one offers, it's nevertheless important to understand what it cannot do. Even in its entirety, the ODNB is not a pure pipeline to the past, but a highly mediated artifact shot through with several kinds of biases, blind spots, and assumptions. Once we notice that some years are mentioned far more frequently than others, that 1914 is the year mentioned most often in the ODNB, that 9 of the top 10 years mentioned most frequently are in the 20th century, and that the years mentioned most frequently in men's lives differ from those mentioned in women's lives, we can begin to wrap our heads around some of the ODNB's implicit biases. Now, this is not a criticism at all. This is merely to note that any claims to be made about the past as such must begin with a clear-eyed sense of ways that the ODNB does and does not represent that past. Indeed, it may be that the most important thing we now know is where we can most effectively dedicate our own scholarly efforts in order to enhance and supplement, rather than merely reproduce, the ODNB's distinctive picture of elite lives at scale.